In 1775, 13 small British colonies clinging to the eastern edge of North America did something that stunned the world. They declared war on the British Empire, the most powerful military force on the planet, ruler of the seas, master of a global empire stretching across 5 continents. The colonists had no professional army, no navy, no treasury, and no guarantee of foreign support. By every rational calculation, they should have been crushed within months. Instead, they created the most influential nation in modern history. This is the full story of the American Revolution. The Revolution did not begin with guns. It began with taxes. After the expensive 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Britain desperately needed money and decided its American colonies should help pay the bill. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed printed materials. The Townshend Acts taxed imported goods. The Tea Act of 1773 gave a British company a monopoly on tea. To the colonists, these were not merely financial burdens. They were a fundamental violation of a principle they considered sacred, that British subjects could only be taxed by their own elected representatives. They had no representatives in the British Parliament. And so the rallying cry that lit the revolutionary fire was born: no taxation without representation. On the night of April 18, 1775, British General Thomas Gage ordered 700 redcoat soldiers to march to Concord, Massachusetts, to seize a colonial weapons depot. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode through the night to warn the colonists. The British were coming. At Lexington Green at dawn, a small band of colonial militiamen stood in the road. Nobody knows who fired first, but when the smoke cleared, 8 colonists were dead. The British marched on to Concord and found an empty weapons store. On their return march to Boston, colonial Minutemen ambushed the redcoats from behind stone walls and trees. By the end of the day, 273 British soldiers had been killed or wounded. The war had begun. Not all revolutionary weapons were muskets. In January 1776, a recently arrived English immigrant named Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. In clear, direct language that any colonist could understand, Paine argued that monarchy itself was absurd, that no man had the right to rule others simply because of his birth. He argued that independence was not just a practical necessity, but a moral imperative. Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies in just 3 months, an astonishing figure for the time, equivalent to millions today. It transformed public opinion. Before Common Sense, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. After it, independence became the only answer. By the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress had been debating independence for months. A 33-year-old Virginia lawyer named Thomas Jefferson was tasked with putting the argument into words. What he wrote became one of the most consequential documents in human history. The Declaration of Independence did not merely announce American independence from Britain. It declared that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. On July 4, 1776, the Congress adopted the Declaration. 13 colonies had become a new nation. Now, they had to survive long enough to make it real. The Revolution came close to dying in the winter of 1777 to 1778. After a series of devastating defeats, General George Washington led his battered army to winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. What followed was 6 months of unimaginable suffering. Nearly 12,000 soldiers endured brutal cold, starvation, disease, and inadequate clothing and shelter. Men wrapped their feet in rags. Hundreds died of typhus, dysentery, and frostbite. At least 2,000 soldiers deserted. But Washington held the army together through sheer force of will, personal presence, and an almost irrational conviction that the cause would ultimately prevail. And then, in February 1778, a Prussian military officer named Friedrich von Steuben arrived and began transforming the ragged Continental Army into a professional fighting force. The revolution's survival ultimately depended on foreign help. Benjamin Franklin, America's most famous citizen, was dispatched to Paris as the new nation's first diplomat. His task: convince France to formally enter the war against Britain. France, still nursing its wounds from the 7 Years' War, needed little persuading in principle, but wanted proof that the Americans could actually fight. That proof came at the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777, where American forces surrounded and captured an entire British army of nearly 6,000 men. It was the turning point of the war. In February 1778, France formally recognized American independence and signed a military alliance. Spain and the Netherlands would follow. Britain now faced enemies on multiple fronts, including a potential invasion of Britain itself. The final act came in Virginia in the autumn of 1781. British General Cornwallis had marched his army to Yorktown, on a peninsula between two rivers, expecting to be supplied and reinforced by the Royal Navy. Instead, a French fleet defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis by sea. Washington and French General Rochambeau marched their combined armies south from New York, 17,000 soldiers, to surround Yorktown by land. Cornwallis was trapped. For 3 weeks, the Allied forces bombarded Yorktown with artillery. Key British positions fell one by one. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army of over 8,000 men. He claimed illness and sent a deputy to hand over his sword. When the British band played during the surrender, they chose a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Yorktown did not formally end the war, but it effectively ended the British will to continue fighting it. Negotiations began in Paris. The British, now facing a hostile France, Spain, and the Netherlands simultaneously, could not afford to continue an expensive war in America. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized the United States of America as a sovereign and independent nation. The new nation's territory stretched from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Mississippi River. It was an extraordinary diplomatic victory. The Americans had negotiated separately from France and secured terms far more generous than even their French allies had expected. 13 colonies had become a nation of 3 million people with a vast continent ahead of them. Winning independence was only the beginning. The 13 newly independent states now had to figure out how to govern themselves together, and they nearly failed. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a national government, were so weak that the federal government could not even collect taxes or enforce its own laws. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia for a constitutional convention that was officially called to revise the Articles. Instead, they scrapped them entirely and wrote a new document from scratch. The result was the United States Constitution, a framework of government built around the separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, with a system of checks and balances designed to prevent any single person or faction from gaining absolute power. It remains, with amendments, the law of the American land today. The American Revolution did not just create one new nation. It sent a political idea around the world that could not be contained. The French Revolution of 1789 was directly inspired by American example. Lafayette, who had fought in America, became a leading figure in Paris. Latin American independence movements from Venezuela to Argentina would explicitly model themselves on American ideals in the following decades. The Declaration of Independence's assertion that all men are created equal would haunt American history, exposing the vast contradiction of a nation founded on liberty that also practiced slavery. The revolution was genuinely radical in its ideas, even if imperfect and incomplete in its application. Its ideas about popular sovereignty, human rights, and limited government would reshape the political landscape of the entire modern world. In 8 years of war against the greatest empire on earth, 13 colonies became a nation. They did it with a ragged army, a borrowed navy, foreign allies, and an idea that people had the right to choose their own government. That idea was not perfect in its application. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence included slaveholders. Women were excluded from the political process. Native Americans were not considered at all. The revolution was unfinished. In many ways, it still is. But it set in motion forces that would continue to push the boundaries of who those words, "all men are created equal," applied to. If this documentary moved you, subscribe and share it, because some revolutions never really end. This has been the American Revolution, Road to Independence. Thank you for watching.